Right now, as you hear this sentence, two shadow economies are generating more combined revenue than most Fortune 500 companies. One moves product, the other moves people. Both have armies, intelligence networks, and kill chains that would rival some nation-states. And by the end of this video, you'll understand how these two underworld machines actually work, how they recruit, how they fight, and why one of them is quietly overtaking the other. Most people think of drug cartels and human trafficking as two separate worlds. One is the stuff of Narcos episodes, flashy kingpins, tunnel networks, and cocaine submarines. The other is something darker, quieter, and harder to look at directly. But here's what almost nobody talks about. These two ecosystems don't just coexist. They compete, they collaborate, and in some parts of the world they've merged into something that didn't exist 20 years ago. Let's start with the model everyone thinks they understand. A drug cartel at its core is a logistics company. Strip away the violence and the mythology, and what you're left with is a supply chain. Raw materials sourced from one continent, processed in another, and distributed across a third. The Sinaloa cartel didn't become the most powerful criminal organization in the Western Hemisphere because of brutality alone. It did it through operational discipline. Think about what it takes to move a single kilogram of cocaine from a Colombian lab to a street corner in Chicago. You need farmers, chemists, packagers, truckers, pilots, boat captains, border scouts, warehouse managers, money launderers, corrupt officials, and enforcers at every single link in that chain. That's dozens of handoffs across thousands of miles. And if any one of them fails, the whole shipment is lost. The cartels that survive are the ones that run this like a business. They franchise territories, they diversify into fentanyl, methamphetamine, and avocados. Yes, avocados. Because the same intimidation infrastructure that moves drugs also controls legal agriculture in parts of Michoacan. And when competition gets too intense, they don't file lawsuits, they deploy paramilitary units. Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generacion fields armored vehicles and 50 caliber weapons. The Gulf Cartel once had an enforcement arm made up of former Mexican Special Forces soldiers. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Human trafficking isn't one thing. It's an umbrella that covers forced labor, sex trafficking, organ harvesting, child exploitation, and debt bondage. And unlike drug trafficking, where the product is consumed and the customer comes back, trafficking in people generates profit through sustained captivity. The victim is the product, and the product keeps earning. The International Labor Organization estimates that forced labor alone generates over $150 billion a year in illegal profits. That's more than the GDP of most African nations. But the structure looks nothing like a cartel. Trafficking networks are decentralized by design. There's rarely a single kingpin. Instead, you get a constellation of recruiters, transporters, document forgers, and exploiters, often operating in cells that don't know each other. A recruiter in Lagos might hand a victim off to a transporter in Agadez who passes them to a smuggler in Tripoli who sells them to an employer in southern Italy. Each link takes a cut. None of them sees the full picture. This decentralization is what makes trafficking networks so resilient. You can arrest a recruiter, you can shut down a route. But the demand remains and new operators fill the vacuum almost immediately. And the victims, they're controlled not primarily through violence, though violence is always present, but through debt. A migrant who paid $6,000 to be smuggled into Europe now owes that debt to the network until it's paid. They work in fields, in factories, in brothels, and the debt by design never actually shrinks. Here's where the conventional wisdom falls apart. For years, law enforcement treated drug trafficking and human trafficking as separate problems with separate task forces. But on the ground, the lines have dissolved. At the US-Mexico border, cartels now control virtually all human smuggling corridors. If you want to cross, you pay the cartel that controls that stretch of territory. And the cartels have figured out that moving people is in some ways a better business than moving drugs. A kilogram of cocaine can only be sold once. A human being can be exploited repeatedly, for labor, for ransom, for trafficking into the sex trade. The numbers back this up. U.S. Customs and Border Protection has documented how cartels have industrialized the smuggling process, charging migrants anywhere from $5,000 to $15,000 per crossing, generating billions annually in revenue that rivals their drug income. In Libya, the same militia groups that traffic weapons and drugs across the Sahel also operate migrant detention camps, where sub-Saharan Africans are held for ransom, sold as laborers, or extorted for additional payment. The UN has documented open-air slave markets operating in the suburbs of Tripoli. In Southeast Asia, criminal syndicates have built entire compound cities, walled complexes in Myanmar, Cambodia, and Laos, where trafficking victims are forced to run online scam operations. These are cyber slavery farms generating billions in fraud revenue, staffed by people who were lured with fake job offers and can't leave. If you compare these two criminal enterprises like businesses, and that's exactly what they are. The differences are revealing. Drug cartels have high startup costs. You need land for cultivation, labs for processing, fleets for transport, and soldiers for security. But the margins are enormous and the revenue is fast. You can move a shipment and have cash in hand within weeks. Trafficking networks have low startup costs. A smartphone, a fake job listing, and a bus ticket can be enough to recruit a victim. The margins are lower per transaction, but the revenue is recurring. A single victim in forced labor can generate income for months or years. Cartels are vulnerable to supply chain disruption. Seize the precursor chemicals for fentanyl and production stalls. Trafficking networks are vulnerability distributed. There's no single choke point to hit. Cartels require territory and are therefore visible. They build infrastructure, they control plazas, they fight wars over geography. Trafficking operations can be run from a laptop. They move through legal migration channels, online platforms, and legitimate business fronts. This is why global trafficking revenue is catching up to, and by some estimates has already surpassed, the drug trade, not because trafficking is more organized, but because it's more adaptable. And this brings us to the part that should concern everyone. The global war on drugs, whatever your opinion of its effectiveness, has produced massive enforcement infrastructure. The DEA alone has over 5,000 special agents. Europol coordinates transnational drug operations across dozens of countries. Militaries deploy naval assets to interdict shipments at sea. The enforcement apparatus for human trafficking is a fraction of that. Most countries have small, underfunded anti-trafficking units. Investigations take years, convictions are rare, and because trafficking victims are often undocumented migrants, they're frequently treated as criminals themselves rather than witnesses. The conviction numbers tell the story. Globally, fewer than 10,000 trafficking prosecutions happen each year for a crime that affects nearly 28 million people. Compare that to hundreds of thousands of drug-related arrests annually in the United States alone. There's a resource asymmetry here that criminal organizations understand perfectly well. If you're a cartel leader weighing your options, the risk-reward calculation increasingly favors diversifying into human exploitation. The penalties are lower, the enforcement is weaker, and the money is nearly as good. What we're witnessing right now isn't just two criminal industries running side by side. It's a convergence. The organizations that used to specialize are becoming generalists. Cartels that once focused exclusively on cocaine are now moving migrants, running extortion rackets, and trafficking people into forced labor on their own operations. Trafficking networks that once operated in the shadows are adopting cartel-style violence to protect their territory. In West Africa, criminal groups operate across the entire spectrum. Drugs moving north through the Sahel, migrants moving north through the same corridors, weapons flowing in every direction. In Central America, gangs like MS-13 and Barrio 18 have always blurred these lines, funding operations through both drug sales and trafficking. The end state of this convergence isn't two competing underworlds. It's one integrated criminal economy, flexible, diversified, and increasingly difficult to disrupt because it doesn't depend on any single revenue stream. $500 billion, 28 million victims, fewer than 10,000 prosecutions. These aren't separate problems. They're the same problem, wearing different faces depending on which border you're standing at. And until the enforcement world catches up to what the criminal world already figured out, that drugs and people move through the same pipes, controlled by the same people, serving the same economy, the gap between these two numbers will only get wider. If this video changed the way you think about organized crime, subscribe. There's more to uncover.